welcome to my first Friday Ask Me Anything, what I call my first Friday AMA. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about writing or projects, even though I can't, I can talk about a little bit of the projects, just not tell all of my secrets, or life or parenting or anything that you might have your heart set on having answered. So I'm here to answer your questions. I do have some that I have collected from places I've been, so I thought I would go ahead and get started with one of those, or two or three, or maybe a whole AMA of them if nobody comments with any questions. I should say you can comment wherever you're seeing this with a question, and I should be able to see it. So here we go. Do your children inspire to write stories? I get this question a lot because I talk about pretty much everywhere I go that I'm a parent and that I have 6 children. And I would say that the easy answer to that question is yes, absolutely. My kids inspire me in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's just by being kind to each other. Sometimes it's in arguments that I will listen in on and use for my stories. Sometimes it's because they'll bring friends over and I'll kind of hear the way that they talk, and that helps with especially the stories that I write in the middle grade space, for now at least, and some of the young adult stuff as well. Sometimes they've inspired me as far as titles are concerned. I share the story of my second son. When he was really young, he was sweeping for after dinner chores, and none of our kids, and actually probably nobody in our family, actually enjoys sweeping. It's like the worst chore ever. So he was, instead of sweeping, he was dancing around with the broom and holding it in his hands and singing. And he said he kind of stopped for a minute and he said, I wonder what it would be like to live in a home with no roof. And my brain just started kind of igniting around that idea. And so I have a story that I've written called The House, or I think it's called The Home Without a Roof. It might be The House Without, no, it's The Home. It's The Home Without a Roof. Because for me, there's a distinction between house and home. Home is kind of a place where you belong, and house is just the structure around us where we live. So yes, my kids inspire me in a lot of different ways, and I feel like they have enhanced my creativity, which is a good thing. How long does it take to write a book? So I get this question a lot from other writers and also children when I visit schools. They always want to know how long it takes to write a book, because when we start a book, we're already kind of looking toward the finish. So what I always tell them is that it depends. It really depends on the story. There are some of my stories that have taken years to write because they're maybe difficult in one way or another. Maybe they're a very personal story, or maybe they're just a structure that I'm not used to, or a point of view that I'm not used to, or maybe I can't quite get the voice for it right. But then there are other stories that only take, 6 months or something, because things sort of flow. I have found that the ones that take less time are typically number 2 or 3 in a series. So I think knowing a character more, almost like a relationship that you have with a person, the more that you know a person, the more you can kind of answer the way that they would act in certain situations. And that's true in writing as well. If we know our characters really well, the story is going to basically write itself. So, but then there are other reasons that a story could take longer. And sometimes it just has to do with finding the right structure for that story. A lot of my books, I write in prose, or I write in poetry, or the newest book that's coming out this month is written in journal entries. So there are a lot of different formats that you can play around with. And sometimes what takes a long time with a book is finding the right format to tell that story. So, and sometimes, I mean, the book that comes out in May at the end of this month, it went from prose to poetry to prose to poetry. And then after like draft 7 or something, I finally was like, I'm going to do journal entries and see how that feels. So sometimes it just, takes playing around with that. So yeah, it depends on the story. Some stories are a lot easier than others for a lot of different reasons. This is a question that I get from kids often. It's kind of silly, but do you like Pokemon? The answer to this question is I don't really have feelings one way or another. My kids collect Pokemon cards, and they get kind of annoying when they're spread out everywhere because there are hundreds of them. And I'm not a person who likes a lot of clutter. I like things that are neat and orderly. So that can become a problem. I also have a couple of kids who are constantly asking if they can walk to the park because they want to play Pokemon Go. And, some days that's annoying and some days it's endearing. And some days it gets them out of the house and I'm like, yeah, please go. So I don't know. I could go either way on Pokemon. Some days I like it. Some days it gets a little annoying. So I will say, though, that I don't enjoy talking about Pokemon a really long time. I have a couple of kids who will talk your ear off about each Pokemon and how they evolve and how they're different. And I try my best to listen, but it gets a little bit hard. What is your favorite book that inspired you? This is a really hard one because when I was a kid, I read everything. I mean, I read Virginia Woolf. I read kid stuff. I read stuff that was in the adult section that, was considered classic literature. So it's hard to just say which one was my favorite. So I think what I like to do is kind of give an example of some of my favorites. So when I guess the ones that I can remember, I have a whole list of ones that were really influential to me. Really, when I was really young, I enjoyed Where the Wild Things Are was one of my favorites. I'm not even sure why. I think because it's just it's a fun story and shows that a boy, no matter what he does or how wild he is or the rumpus that he creates in his house, is still loved and still gets his dinner. I loved that concept. I remember reading a lot of Ramona Quimby. Judy Blume was huge for me because she was the first person I read who talked about female puberty. And that was really helpful because in my day and age, we didn't talk about those things very often. And so the education around girls' puberty was kind of non-existent almost. So we got our education from Judy Blume books, which I appreciated. I read a lot of Scott Odell, and he's a historical writer who writes about a lot of Indigenous America, which I'm not sure how much of that is correct now. But I remember being really taken by the stories, and he typically, I think most of them probably had a strong female character who, Island of the Blue Dolphin, she lives on her own in this island and survives, packs of dogs and trying to find food for herself on this island. And so I think for me, it was like the female empowerment. There was this strong female character and she could survive anything. So I found a lot of joy out of those books. Let's see. Yeah, so in high school, I read most of the classics, which in those days, and still it's unequal among men and women writers. But most of them were men. I really loved Charles Dickens. I love the way he could write about the poor and show that they had something to contribute to society, because I grew up as a kid who didn't have a whole lot, and I wanted to know too that I had something to contribute to society, that I had ideas that were worth pursuing and worth listening to. I really, really loved and still love today. Toni Morrison was a huge influence for me. Her book Beloved was one of the first that I discovered, and then once I did that, I kind of went back and read everything she had written. Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, who I've already mentioned, they were huge influences to me. I read all of Sylvia Plath's journals and all of her poetry, The Bell Jar, of course. So all of those books were pretty influential to me growing up. So I still love them today. I've gone back and reread a lot of them, and they still hold up for me. So, oh, and I will say, I tell kids a lot of times too that every time I read a book, and this is why it's so hard for me to point to one book as what inspired me. Every time I read a book, I remember thinking, I want to do this someday, because I just loved reading stories and having that joy of kind of seeing into the mind of an author. And I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm going to do with my life. So that, I feel like every book kind of inspired that. So, all right, on any of your books, did they make fun of it? This came from a kid. I think it's a kid who maybe has some weird ideas and is made fun of a little bit. And that hurts my heart, because I don't think we should make fun of any ideas. I think every idea can be pursued in the right way if we help children pursue them in the right way. Like, nothing is too weird. I feel that way. I write down every idea I have. So, but I will say that not necessarily my books being made fun of, but I do remember when my first book published, The Colors of the Rain, I can't remember if it was a review or if it was just something I saw maybe on Twitter when somebody was talking about it or something, but I think it actually was a review, maybe a Goodreads review, which I do not read anymore. And it said something like, this is not, how did they phrase it? This plot is kind of unbelievable and they were talking about the family. And what's interesting is that it actually came from a real story. And somebody like right after that contacted me and said, oh my gosh, it's like you wrote my whole story, because it hadn't happened just once. It had happened, in other people's lives too. So I just find that interesting, that when one person thinks something is unbelievable, it's actually been the lived experience of another person. And I think that review really got to me, because what we're saying when we say this is unbelievable and it's a personal story is that the person's experience didn't matter. We kind of erase that experience. And I think as critics and as readers, we need to think about that a little bit more. If we have those feelings like, oh my gosh, this would never happen, most of the time, I can't say most of the time, but a lot of the time, writers are writing from their actual lived experience. And so it doesn't make sense for somebody to say that could never happen. Just because it hasn't happened in their sphere or in their life doesn't mean that it could never happen. So I think that was probably one of the reviews that kind of hurt the most because I mean, I don't like having my experiences erased. So yeah, be careful when you're reviewing books, just be a little gentle, maybe, writers are sensitive people, so we should protect that part of them. I know they say writers are supposed to have a thick skin, but I spent 10 years in journalism, and you're supposed to have a thick skin for that. And I never got a thick skin. And I feel like that's a good thing because it helps me empathize with people a little more. You know, maybe that reviewer was just having a bad day, and I'm glad they never experienced what I had experienced. So, okay. Do you think about the stories and poems that you write? I think this is sort of a way of asking, do you plan your stuff before you write, or do you brainstorm? I call it brainstorming. There's kind of a debate between whether flying by the seat of your pants, which means just like writing a story without planning anything, or plotting, which is like creating an outline for the story, is better. And I think it just depends on the writer. Writers have to find what works for them. I'm not prescriptive in any way, but for me, I call it brainstorming is what works. And I'll take a long time to brainstorm my stories. And it kind of starts out as like a general brainstorm sheet where I just, for a couple of months before I think I'll get started on a story, I just kind of jot down some ideas, things that might occur to me, subjects I might want to pursue, or like setting details that might come into play, character details that, strike me in the middle of the night. So I keep a running brainstorm sheet for that. And then when I sit down to actually write on something, I start with character and I break out what the character's emotional wound is. So something that, it's like a shard of glass that punctures them in different ways throughout the story. So I'll figure out that emotional wound, and then I'll figure out how that kind of manifests in different ways, like what the triggers are, or responses to certain situations because of that emotional wound. Names, of course, that's like the first thing I figure out are the names of all of the characters in the story. Sometimes the names come a little bit later because if there's a really strong personality, I want to kind of make sure that the name reflects that personality a little bit. It sounds kind of weird, but it's names are important in stories, and I always take a lot of care with naming my characters. So after the initial character sheet is done, I go through what the character needs to learn, and what they want and what they need, and all of those details. And then I sit down. I actually have it's like a chart kind of thing where I break down the story structure. And I do all of this by hand. I don't do any of it on my computer because I feel like I'm just freer to write and jot down ideas whenever I'm, sitting down with a pen and paper. So I have these papers that are sectioned out into, I should have brought one so I could show you, sectioned out into like opening image, theme rated, catalyst, setup. Setup comes before the catalyst. The thinking about what to do after the catalyst, the brain to two. So it's very much story structure oriented, because I feel like story structure is really important to keep stories tight and to keep the pacing of it so that it doesn't go off the rails somewhere. So I actually I plan all of this out with the understanding that if, as I'm writing, a character kind of goes in a different direction, then I can pivot and think about, okay, where does the story go now? Because this character, a lot of times though, I know the character so well that it doesn't happen that way, because before I sit down and structure it all out, I've spent a lot of time with the character. So now, as far as poems and any essays that I might write, I do the same with essays, where I'll just kind of jot down things as I'm thinking about it, maybe the week before I need to write the essay, just to keep the ideas flowing. And as far as poetry is concerned, I kind of keep a running list of poems that I want to write, the subject matter or I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like write a poem about a street sign that you saw in your neighborhood, and write a poem around it. So it's kind of like little prompts that I keep, and every so often I'll take out that journal and just, so I don't really plan the poems, but everything else I do plan. So, and I think about it all the time, because that's what a writer does. So, all right, was it hard to be an author at first? I would say it's hard to be an author at every step of the process. It's like the best job in the world, but it's also one of the hardest jobs in the world. And I'll tell you why. Not only is it really hard to write a story, like you have to sit down and write it from start to finish. And it's a lot of words and it's a lot of pages. And even after you've written it the first time, there are going to be several other times that you have to read it and rewrite it. So that's hard in itself, but it's also an emotionally hard job, because it but there is so much rejection in what we do. So you get rejection when you're trying to find an agent. You get rejection when you found an agent and your agent is sending your story out to editors. You get rejection once the book is published and it's open to readers and to judgment. And so there's kind of rejection at every venture, at every, what do you call it? Every part of the process. And that might not be hard for some people, but as I mentioned, I do not have a thick skin, and I love what I do. And every story that I put out there is very personal to me. And I think this is true of lots of writers, but I care about my stories a lot. And when they undergo rejection, it feels like my child is undergoing rejection. And by extension, I suppose it feels like I'm undergoing rejection as well, even though I know that it is no commentary on how good a writer I am, or any of those things, or how how good a person I am. But because we write so personally, it does feel like there's a little bit of, well, they rejected me. So that's been hard at every turn, I think. So I will say that it does get a little bit easier when you get those yeses, though. So once you get a yes, it gets a little bit easier to deal with rejections. And I have an agent who is very good about reminding me that it only takes one. So what she means by that is it only takes one yes. It only takes one editor at one publishing house saying, I love this book, I want to publish it. So that's really helpful to have people in your corner reminding you that one rejection doesn't mean 50 rejections from all of the editors who are sitting with your book and deciding if it belongs on their list. And also, rejection is very, it depends on the person. So it's not like, none of it is a commentary on how good a writer you are, because our tastes are different. The books that I like are not books you like. And that's true for editors and agents as well. So that's important to keep in mind. Do you have any pets? And what are their names? I do have two pets. I have an orange tabby cat and a black cat. The orange tabby is named River, and the black cat is named Harris. And they do absolutely nothing to further my career, but they enjoy being mentioned, I think. The orange tabby, River, he's kind of a needy cat whenever he wants affection, but he doesn't often want affection. He's kind of he's like a wild cat. He prefers to be like free. And then Harris I'm pretty sure has ADHD, so he's a lot of fun to live with, but he's cute too. Why did you choose to be an author? So I kind of went over this. I get this question a lot when I visit schools. I kind of went over this when I was talking about the books that have inspired me. Every time I would read a book as a kid, I wanted to write them. And I started writing really early in life with, writing and illustrating stories. My mom always kept me supplied with journals and pencils. So I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. It was like my favorite thing in the world to do. And I loved reading books and thinking I could bring the same kind of joy to a reader that this book brings to me. And I just thought that would be the coolest job in the world. And it really is. Like it's just the coolest job ever. Because writing for children, when we're adults, we rarely reread books that we have read. But when we're kids, we read our favorite books over and over and over again. I mean, I read Sarah Plain and Tall, Island of the Blue Dolphins, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, multiple times. I can't even tell you how many times, probably, 20 or more times, because those were some of my favorites. And writing a book for kids and hoping that our book will become a favorite and that it will be reread. I mean, what a privilege that is. Thinking about the readers and the joy that we can bring to them and the understanding and the acceptance and the love. I just think that's one of the best things in the world. So I didn't know that as a kid, I've connected it now, but I think it did have something to do with how often I would reread those books that I loved and just thinking that's what I want to do. So it's just such a privilege. So, okay, I don't have any questions in the chat, so I'm going to do one more. Excuse me. This is a question that came from some kids at a school when I talked about how my brother and sister and I lived in what we thought was a haunted house, and we saw some like ghostly activity. So they said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And I would have to say, I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do have a story from when I actually use this in a story of mine called The Legend of Woman Hollering Creek. It's kind of a flashback of the main character. But after my great grandfather died, and in the book, it's the character's grandfather. After my great grandfather died, I stayed with my great grandmother, and that wasn't such an unusual thing. Like we stayed over at her house all the time, but it was like the first time I think I had stayed in her room. And during the night, I woke up and I saw something at the end of her bed. And to me, I think I was maybe 8 or 9 at the time, and I've never forgotten it. I've written about it like in middle school and high school. I have old writings from those times when I wrote about this experience. But it looked to me like what was at the end of the bed was my great grandfather. And it had been kind of a sudden death. Like he was out in his garden and he had a heart attack, which was actually quite beautiful because he was a gardener and he always said, if I die, I want to do it right here in my garden. And he actually did. So it was sudden and it was unexpected for us. And I remember whatever was at the end of the bed that looked like him said, I just want you to know I'm okay and I'm in a better place. And in my child mind, I remember I had been, we had gone to or we were making plans to go to the funeral and stuff. And I remember thinking, I really hope he's okay. Like there was this pit in my stomach and I didn't know, I still don't know like what's next, if there is anything next. And but I specifically remember that experience and thinking maybe ghosts are real. So so I don't know. I can't say one way or the other, but that is an experience that my child mind had. And there were other experiences where we were at a, I'm actually going to write about this soon too. We were at a campground with my brother and my two cousins, and we all saw the same ghost standing on top of a big trash receptacle. So, and she was holding a baby, like it was the same, all of us saw the same thing, which is just weird to me. So who knows? I think there are mysteries in the world that can't be explained. So maybe. All right, so those are all the questions that we have for this Ask Me Anything. So if you have any questions that you might want me to answer at the next AMA, you can just put them in the comments or send me a note or something, and I will do my best to get to them and get them answered. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all next time.